We have already heard about institutional narration, and you must have guessed that one of the goals of institutional narration is to create the impression of a faithful reflection of reality on the screen. So this is very close to, we sometimes use the word realism for such processes, where we see logically coherent, believable, familiar images of reality, or images of sort of interactions between people and so on. So one must remember, because institutional narration, the kind of narration that we saw before that, primitive mode of representation, etc., all of them are basically dependent on certain codes. So it's not as if one just opens the camera onto reality and there is a straightforward correspondence, straightforward kind of capture of what the camera sees. Usually films are not made like that. Films are cut and joined. Films are fragmentary. They jump from one location to another. They move from one time to another. They move sometimes between people and so on. So it's a kind of, you don't see solid time. We don't see solid, uninterrupted time or space on the screen. It never happens. Institutional narration actually tried to find out, most famously in Hollywood, how to create a code which when followed, if you follow that code, one could create a sense of flowing, uninterrupted, completely convincing, completely logical kind of picture of reality in the film. So it's a matter of codes. Realism is not a matter of just capturing reality on the screen. Realism, like any other aesthetic convention in art, is a matter of employing certain rules, principles and codes which would create an impression of reality on the screen. So it's a creation, the creation of an impression of reality on the screen. Let us remember that. And the things that we have already learned about institutional narration, about the way it organizes space, about the way it organizes time. Right? You don't see an action in its full duration. We usually see it compressed. If the action takes 5-10 minutes in reality, on the screen it takes about a minute or sometimes even less than that. So time is compressed, space is, you see only one part of the space, never all of it, and so on. Sometimes bodies, objects, human figures, we see parts. We see only one part of the body. We sometimes hear the voice, sometimes not see the person, but hear the voice. So all these connections have to be made in such a way that we have a sense that everything is exposed, everything is captured, that there is no hidden aspect of reality. This is what one critic called the excessive obviousness of Hollywood realism. So institutional narration in the Hollywood kind of mold was a cinema of excessive obviousness, that you don't have any hidden aspects, hidden recesses. There's no lack of any rational explanation for what happens, what the characters do, the way the incidents follow each other, and so on. It's a matter of codes, how these codes come to have a worldwide currency. not being confined to Hollywood cinema only. Realism is not a natural thing. To be realistic is to follow a set of principles of constructing a scene or constructing a story, which then would give the impression of, unmediated, direct kind of capture, direct portrayal of reality. Otherwise, everything is mediated. You choose a frame, you always keep something out of the frame. When you frame something, always keep something out of the frame. Right? When you join one frame to another, you always try to, for example, in the standard Hollywood narration, the editor or the person who is shooting the film will always try to shoot the shots. A scene is divided into many shots, so that on the editing table, you will not feel a jerk. You will not feel that from one shot within the same sequence to the other shot, somebody is jumping, jerk. So if there is a jerk, if there is a little jolt, then the spectator is likely to become aware that there is a camera and an editing machine at play. But when we see these films, we are asked to forget that there is machinery involved, that there are people, lights, machinery, apparatus, rules, principles involved. We are invited to look at lives of the characters on the screen as if nothing stands between us and them. But definitely the camera stands between us and the characters. The editing stands between us and the characters, isn't it? So you have to hide that. So you take shots in such a way so that maintaining screen direction. If you enter left, exit right, and it's the same movement, then in the same next shot, you enter left again, exit right. If you do in the next shot the opposite, you change the direction in the following shot, then there will be a little jolt. And that would remind people that editing is taking place. But the work of the standard realist film editor is to hide his or her work. That his or her work in the film should be hidden. So all these joints, all these joining should be hidden. It's called seamless. The seam is the line, the stitching line. If you hide the stitching line, if you are stitching it in such a way that nobody can see the joining, then of course you get the sense of a whole sort of tapestry without any cutting and joining. That's the idea that realism attempts to give in standard conventional narration. The essay that we shall read as part of this episode is by probably the most influential theorist of cinematic realism. His name is André Bazin. He was a French critic and scholar who wrote many articles on cinema. He was a film lover, a film society organizer, and of course a film critic and scholar, and editor also, editor of a very important film magazine. Now the essay that we shall read, a very widely read essay by Bazin, actually makes an argument that tries to say that Hollywood realism, the kind of realism that we see in the standard conventional Hollywood kind of dramatic film, dramatically constructed film, is not the real kind of realism. It's not the true realism. What he finds to be more truer or more faithful to reality, and he thinks that that is the vocation of cinema, is the kind of realism you find in the Italian cinema in the immediate post-Second World War period. These filmmakers were Luchino Visconti, Roberto Rossellini, and Vittorio De Sica, most prominently, but there were other filmmakers. And this movement is called the Italian neo-realist movement. Neo-realist movement. It happened, the heyday, the most productive period of this Italian neorealism is roughly between 1942-43 and 1953-54. Actually, it's for 10 to 12 years that the most productive period of neorealism happened. After that, it continued in many forms, shapes, and through many mutations, and it actually became a global movement in the sense that India, China, Africa, Latin America, many other European countries had their own moment of neorealism, one can say. Now, Bazin says that if you are cutting up a scene according to the points of interest that Hollywood does, according to the emphasis, dramatic emphasis and points of interest, and according to what the main characters are doing and feeling, if you cut up a scene like that and try to direct the spectator's attention to look at this, look at that, look at this, this is important, that should come in close up, that if you cut and join films like that, then you are violating the wholeness, the integrity of reality. And Italian neorealism tried to avoid that. They tried to stay away from these interference in reality. They tried to take, for example, use long takes often, where a whole scene almost will be taken in one shot rather than chopping it up, cutting it up. They often use, not always of course, often use the wide angle lens. These things and many other things, of course, shooting in real light, shooting on location, not using the studio sets, shooting without stars, right? All these things, Bazin thought, were nothing but an expression of a commitment to the complexity and wholeness of reality. And you also allow, in that case, the spectator to have a free kind of play with the film, in the sense that the spectator can derive his or her own meanings from the film. You are not directing his attention, constantly cutting up the scene and guiding the spectator through the most salient points, dramatically speaking. You are not doing that. And if you are not doing that, you are presenting the scene in its wholeness. So that is what was salutary about neorealism, Bazin thought. And he thought neorealism was the final point in the evolution of film language. Very simply put, that is what he is trying to say. But one must remember that Bazin was criticized for assuming that there is a film style, neorealism or any other name you give it, that there can be a film style that does not employ any artificiality, any code, any rule. You can just use long takes where you stand on one thing for a long time, not cut up. That's called long take. Where you use a long shot, long take, deep focus, ordinary people as actors, available light and so on. The use of these things does not guarantee or does not mean that you are not using codes of artistic construction. All art has to select, mold, shape, change something that it has as a raw material. Neorealists had to do the same thing. They had to select one part of visible, audible reality. They had to join it with another part. They had to give it through soundtrack, through lighting, through dialogue, through many other means that cinema has at its disposal. It has a certain kind of direction, a certain kind of emphasis. Selections and the process of construction is an ongoing process. You can't postpone it. You can't just say that I abandon all that. In that case, you have to just go open your camera and stay there for hours on end. You can't edit, you can't have characters, you can't have story, you can't have any acting, performance. All these, performance, storytelling, lighting, editing, whatever editing it is, it may not be Hollywood editing, all of that has to follow certain rules, otherwise they won't appeal to us. We won't find them intelligible. So Bazin, in his enthusiasm for the neorealist filmmakers, says very important things, extremely important things, but at the same time seems to completely ignore that neorealism is also an ism. It's a way of showing reality. It's not the only way, or it's not the purest way. There's nothing called a pure way of showing reality. Then we wouldn't have made films. We would have just gone and watched reality. And even then, we wouldn't have found reality to be always meaningful. To give it meaning, to give it significance, to give it form, and all art has form, you have to follow certain conventions of storytelling, editing, shooting, acting, clothing. Many such conventions have to be followed. So what we are trying to suggest is that realism is a matter of convention, both in the institutional mode of narration and also in the kind of narration that Bazin thought was non-institutional, like the neorealist film.